The Alliance for Progress was designed, of course, to help the communists take over Latin America with some $20 billion to be used to build up the prestige of the pro-communist and left-wing politicians all over those countries, to whom we give the money and let them use it to have the power and the patronage and all, at the expense of the anti-communists, breaking them down, leaving them out in the cold, letting everybody see that they don't have any prestige anymore. The whole money is completely for the purpose of building up the pro-communists all over, one country after another, by all of the usual subtle means, and breaking down the opposition. That's just one of the many things going on to turn all of the whole continent into part of the communist empire. Well, on the other side is Hawaii. It was in the fall of 1956 that a subcommittee of the United States Senate spent considerable time in Hawaii investigating the influence of Harry Bridges and his union on the economy of the island. And this subcommittee was composed of Republicans and Democrats both. And they issued a report, I believe a unanimous report, I'm quite sure of it, that the stranglehold of Harry Bridges and his union on the economy of the islands was so great as to constitute virtual political control as well. This was way back in 1956. And I can assure you the situation has got far, far worse since then. One of the clearest indications of how bad it's gone was the attitude of the leading Hawaiian families with regard to statehood. Now, there's nothing that 15 or 20 years ago that the bishops and the judges and the Castles and the Cooks and the Dillinghams would have wanted more than statehood for Hawaii. But by the time it came, it was obviously communist drive. You see, the drive to make Alaska and Hawaii states was completely communist, planned and pushed through our government. And it was so obvious that whereas IMUA, of course, is the Hawaiian Residents Association, the great anti-communist organization originally, and still a good organization of leading Hawaiians. IMUA never took an official position with regard to statehood, which itself is incredible that they didn't take a position for it. They never took one against it, but I can assure you that the leading citizens of Hawaii became opposed to statehood, because they could see what would happen. They could see that Hawaii would be sending communist or pro-communist people to our government. They would lose the protection that they had to some extent from it being a militarily run protectorate, and the whole thing just let the communist influence grow, and they were opposed to it. I said I wasn't going into details. I'm not going to go into too many, but let me give you one key to how bad the thing became. In the last territorial elections in Hawaii, before it became a state, out of 69 offices, elective offices in the islands, for everything, 37 of those men who won ran on the published written endorsement of Harry Bridges' endorsing committee. And that was a 9-man committee consisting of 5 known admitted communists and 4 others, if you can imagine what they were. And their written endorsement was used by 37 people out of those 69 that won jobs. You have such situations as Thomas Yagi, known admitted communist, got himself made chairman of the board of trustees of the Maui hospitals, which is a dozen hospitals, half state-run and half private enterprise, a combination affair. He has a known communist, the head of this group of hospitals. George Cook and Sophie Cook set out to undo it, to throw him out. Now, those of you who know the islands realize what those 2 names mean. Go back to the fact that the Cooks, the Judds, as I mentioned before, the bishops, the Castles, and in later years the Cunninghams have run the islands. And it's been sort of an oligarchy, but they've done a very good job of it just the same. George Cook graduated from Yale in 1905 and married Sophie Judd, which was like uniting the Lancasters and the Yorks in England for practical purposes. And of course they run that huge ranch on Molokai, about 70,000 acres, 46,000 of it in pineapple and sugar, for a lifetime. And George Cook himself became president of the Hawaiian Senate for years, which is the highest elective office for the territory. And all I'm trying to tell you is that there's nobody ever had as much prestige in the Hawaiian Islands as George and Sophie Cook. The combination of the two for years. And with all of their influence, they couldn't throw a known communist out of the chairmanship of the Board of Trustees of the Moy hospitals. The communists own Hawaii, ladies and gentlemen, completely. They can do anything they want to with it at any time. They're not doing it because it doesn't fit yet. Whenever they reach the point, why, they'll take Hawaii, and you'll hear in Washington, oh, this is too bad, but after all, it's better to save the other 49 states than just to fight there. We must compromise. We must be realistic. We must give it to them if it fits their pattern, and they can take it any time and start murdering the anti-communists. It's a horrible picture, and what's being done to the good people there, including some of the older Polynesian stock that wouldn't want any part of this, semi-Polynesian stock. There's not too many of the native Hawaiians left, as most of you know, very few thousand, completely pure-blooded native Hawaiians. But what's being done to them, the way they've been pressured into the unions under Bridges' absolute tyrannical control is terrific. So we got Hawaii in communist hands for all practical purposes on the other side of us, and Cuba on this side, under Castro in communist hands. And now Latin America down below us. I've talked about Canada to the north, and I'll just make it in one sentence. Most of you know how much influence the communists have in this government, in our country, in the government, and in many other divisions of our national life. I can assure you it's worse in Canada, ladies and gentlemen, quite a bit worse, quite a bit more brutal and more daring, more audacious into what they can do and do to anybody that tries to be anti-communist really in Canada. Life goes on with less fuss about it. There's no John Birch Society up there to stir them all up. And there's less noise about communism in Canada, and therefore less pressures of kinds. But the Canadian government's been run by the communists for a long time, as anybody who would study the actions of the people running it could tell. It was all right on the records what they were doing. If you'd only believe your own eyes, it's what you see. Now, so now let's finally come to the extent of communist infiltration and influence right inside our own continental borders. And even in 1958, that subject was far too large to do anything more than indicate a few pointers. But for a first danger sign to talk about, I mentioned that the unions, which control our shipping and many vital parts of our economy, are communist-ruled or communist-dominated. And just for one instance, I mentioned that 75 vital links in the most secret communications of our government itself, including those of the Pentagon to its own Air Force bases in New York, Maine, England, Canada, and Newfoundland, are all available, were then, still are, to the members of one union, the American Communications Association, which was kicked out of the CIO in 1950 as being too communistic even for that outfit. In May 1957, and that's why I had them in these notes, because it had just happened within the preceding year, the president of this union and 5 other officials and members invoked the Fifth Amendment when questioned about Communist Party membership. Now, this is a maintenance union. Had about 8,000 members the last I know, that's all. And because it's a maintenance union and therefore had to be everything physically to do with these means of communication, the members of this union were then and still are in position to put their hands on any and all messages over these 75 links in our government's own most secret communications system. Now, that's bad, but the real significance of what I've just been saying lies in the fact that this door to betrayal is not only wide open, but has been known to be wide open for years. It's not just we that have published it. It's been published by many others, and there was at least one briefing session in the Pentagon a few years ago when some high-ranking officers were told all about it, but nothing happened. With it completely known that this is true, nobody in Congress, in the executive branch, in the Pentagon itself, nobody has even dared to try to close this door to betrayal. Now, this is one indication of how powerful the communist influence had become already 7 and 8 and 10 years ago in almost all of our federal agencies. You remember that a 25-year career man in our State Department resigned about 8 years ago to tell the American, that's Brighton Barron, to tell the American people in his book, Inside the State Department, of the treasonous falsification of information concerning our foreign affairs which was going on there every day, all the time. And the communist influence over our mass media of communication, press, radio, television, was so great that in the case of most of the audiences where I was talking then, and even now if it's a public audience, most of the people never heard of Brighton Barron nor of his book at all. Now, that brings up what is the worst kind of disappointment we face in this whole fight. People will say to me, look, Bob, you're crazy. Things can't possibly be as bad as you say. There can't be that many communists or that much communist influence in Washington, because if there were, somebody would resign and get out and tell us so. Somebody would be patriotic enough. We must have an Arnold von Winkelried somewhere in the crowd who would come out and tell us the truth at whatever it cost him. And that, of course, is the most discouraging of all the things that you ever hear, because, ladies and gentlemen, they're doing it all the time. There's all kinds of Americans who've tried to give up their careers, their lives, if necessary, or anything, to tell the American people the truth, and they simply cannot break through that blanket of obfuscation that has been built. Look at Arthur Bliss Lane. Arthur Bliss Lane was a great career diplomat, and had been an ambassador to 2 or 3 countries, and excellent career, great man and good man in every way. And by some mistake, which they sometimes make, like they did when they sent Jacques Soustelle to Algeria, the left made a mistake and sent Arthur Bliss Lane to Poland to be our ambassador to that new provisional government of Poland, so-called, which was the Lublin Gang in Warsaw in the middle of 1945. Lane saw what was going on. He didn't even grasp it all, but he saw a lot of it. He did everything he could to oppose it. You remember Dean Acheson put through a loan of $90 million called to Poland. It was to the Lublin Gang, of course. Not only did they send through the 2 loans totaling $90 million, but he and his law firm got a commission for doing it, for goodness sakes. He and Donald Hiss and the rest of them. But anyway, they put through this loan over Lane's protest. He said, I protest with everything in me, with all the sincerity I can convey. I've forgotten his exact words. Of course, this money, as I say, was being used by Menshikov and the communists to break down opposition and to feed those that would go along with their ration cards and all. Lane saw all these things that were happening. He saw the terrific efforts to break down American prestige, which was so important. The American embassy. Before Lane left, there were 10 different peasant families that just moved into the embassy as squatters and were living there in whatever filth they wanted to bring with them. In the American embassy in Warsaw. Nothing Lane could do about it. It was to show the contempt for America. And so Lane, after those phony elections in January 1947, resigned, gave up his whole career, his friends, friendship, everything, to tell the American people what had happened. He wrote this book, I Saw Poland Betrayed. Now this was not, incidentally, we publish it in a $1 reprint for anybody who wants it. It's a not easy reading book, but it's a great book. It's a good book. Now this was not some journalist seeking to sell a book by sensationalism. This was not somebody telling what he'd heard secondhand. This is a great American diplomat at tremendous cost to himself, telling what he had seen and what he'd been forced to participate in. Clear, sheer, direct, definite betrayal of a great country, Poland, into communist hands that he saw. And the book was, I Saw Poland Betrayed. It should have shaken the American people back on their heels. The book didn't even create a ripple. Sold around 2,000 or 3,000 copies, most of them probably to libraries. And the communists succeeded in getting them out. The publisher would not reprint. And if you wrote them, why, you got double talk as to why not. They were good publishers, too. But they had a big line. They had a lot of things to consider. A few years ago, if you'd wanted a very interesting experience, it would be to go try to get a copy. Just to find a copy yourself to read of Arthur Bliss Lane's I Saw Poland Betrayed. You could go to the library in a big city, and in those times you'd still find the card in the files. But you send for the book, and they come back present and tell you how sorry they were. Something had happened to it. The book wasn't there. It had disappeared, been taken out and not brought back. Finally, the cards even were disappearing. And the book, as I say, didn't even create a ripple. Lane had given up his whole life career and everything for it. It so happened that Arthur Bliss Lane became a good friend of mine after that. Lloyd, you might even remember, Arthur Bliss Lane came to Belmont to speak for me. He and his wife visited briefly in our home during the 1952 campaign because of this. And I got to know him fairly well. Arthur Bliss Lane died, ladies and gentlemen, the only man of whom I ever knew it could be said truthfully, honestly, he literally died of a broken heart. We came along years later and published his book in a dollar reprint and have sold maybe 100,000 copies, which is still not many, but it's reached a lot of people, and 25 times as many as he ever reached with his original book. And some of these books we've brought back from the dead. We've sold a lot more than that, but even this one we've distributed quite a bit of it. But this is an illustration. Maybe I should more briefly give you another one. Medford Evans. Medford was a college professor, family, no money, like most college professors, and by some miracle of mistake or something, he was made chief of training of our whole atomic energy program, chief of security training. And well, it's the best job he ever had before, and I'm sure ever will have, either for money or prestige or anything else. And Medford discovered, by the time he'd settled down in the job, the treason going on was just incredible, blatant, brazen treason. And then he discovered what was further, he couldn't do anything about it. No matter what kind of orders he issued, what he tried to do, they would just circumvent it or ignore it. Nothing at all. He spent 2 years about that. He resigned, gave up the job, gave up a lot of support, other prospects, endangered any kind of job he might ever have again, to tell the American people the truth. He wrote this book, The Secret Struggle for the A-Bomb, in which he pointed out that we got confirmation of this from some other sources later, and some of them rather interesting. But anyway, he pointed out, you remember the communists went through all the motions of exploding an A-bomb, and Truman announced a few weeks ahead they were going to, that we had discovered they were going to, and then after that they were going to explode others, and did. They were building up, they were catching us. As they've gone through the motions now, pretending that they've got all this atomic military power and so forth. Well, this was in the beginning, when it had been understood that they didn't have any atomic bombs at all. And they finally came to the point where they exploded this one with great fanfare, let it be leaked out or known and so forth. Medford Evans wrote a book. He said, heck, the communists may have exploded some A-bombs, but they've never built one. Didn't have a chance in the world. The A-bombs that the communists exploded, they just took the parts from our different plants and walked away with them and put them together in Moscow, or wherever they did it. And you read it, it's quite convincing. There's been plenty of other stuff too. But the secret struggle for the A-bomb was the story of the incredible treason in our whole atomic bomb setup in the plants, where, as he said, the communists could just walk away with anything they wanted physically, and nobody could do anything about it, including himself as chief of security training. And the book is just actually laid out. Now that, dealing with what was supposed to be America's great deterrent to communist advance and so forth, should have rattled America's teeth. Well, the truth of it, ladies and gentlemen, the book sold 2,600 copies. One man bought 1,000 copies, which he distributed or gave away, and the other 1,600 is all that were ever sold in the regular run. The final other 400 copies out of the 3,000 that were printed, nobody quite knew what happened until they were offered to us unbound here a few months ago. And we bought them unbound and are selling them right now, having had them bound, just the 400 that got left. But this book, say, should have caused nothing. They just could not break through the blanket of obfuscation that the left wing has created in so many ways. Now, you could go on with illustration after illustration about this. There are people all the time doing their utmost to tell the American people what's happening in Washington. And it's got so bad now, the lie is so big that even the best of them can't get believed. Even people of as much standing as Arthur Bliss Lane had, they can't get believed today when they try to tell the truth of what's going on. It is just so far advanced and so complete. So, as I say, it's a very discouraging thing when people say, if it were true, people would tell us. We're spending our whole lives taking the material that people have told us, very good people with finest trying to get enough people to read it so they can understand it and believe it. Let's go on with a few other pointers in connection with this advance on the United States in this third strategic step. The best informed authorities were saying by 1958 that there were at least 30 huge communist espionage rings operating in this country against only 2 or 3 that had been only partly exposed. Well, some of my attackers picked this up and said, there's Mr. Welch being very vague, and at least 30, and he doesn't name them and anything at all. So I had to go to the trouble for somebody a couple of years ago. I pointed out at once that the authentic facts were there were 38, but that instead of exaggerating, I had tried to be very careful, very cautious, and it said about 30 instead of 38. But all you've got to do is to go to the records of the either the House Committee or the SISS, I think it's the House Committee, and you'll find some hearings that were under oath, very definite and very positively setting forth that there were 38 espionage rings working in the United States, unexposed, against only 2 or 3 that had been partly exposed. And the statement was correct, except it was an understatement. Not only had already effective exposure of espionage rings already been stopped before 1958, but scores of known communist sympathizers had already been restored by Supreme Court rulings, you'll remember, to their former jobs within our federal government. And all exposure of communists in government had really and truly been stopped as it has today. Most people don't know that. If you ask a really fairly well-informed, patriotic student of the communist conspiracy today, well, how is the House Committee on Un-American Activities doing? And he will say, well, considering the Supreme Court decisions that have hamstrung it, and considering the atmosphere created by the press, I would say it's doing the best it can, doing not too bad. That would be true if he'd add one phrase, not doing too bad, except with regard to communists in government. Around 1955, when Eisenhower's 1954 gag letter became effective and its full effect was understood, there hadn't even been any attempt to expose communists in government. You've seen the SISS and especially the HCUA going through some hearings, sometimes very effective on the part of the HCUA, exposing communists in education, or in labor, or in finance. And the American people haven't stopped to think. They see these, they read the headlines. Nothing to do with government. Not a single effort to expose communists in government since 1955. Because the gag order, which Eisenhower brought out to stop McCarthy, partly, there are other purposes too, to stop McCarthy's investigations of the communists at Monmouth, which were reaching right square up to the Army Loyalty Board and to the CIA, and they had to be stopped. That order was issued over the weekend. They managed to get that hearing adjourned to have time to do something, and when McCarthy came back Monday morning, nobody could testify. And the effect of the order first began to show up on the reverse side. It showed up when some good Americans working in the government wanted to testify. And it was one of the old McClellan hearings, not the McClellan rackets hearing that you heard so much about later and where Robert Kennedy made himself so ingloriously famous, but an earlier McClellan Hearings Committee investigating the sale and delivery of things like copper wire. I believe we're 250,000 miles or something of copper wire to, I've forgotten the quantity, to the Russians. And this was being investigated, the selling of the strategic material to the communists. And the committee, McClellan had a couple of good men from one of our departments there, and they started to answer questions, and then they froze. And one of them explained, he said, Mr. Chairman, I would like to answer the question. I'm in the middle of this. I see it from where I sit. I can tell you it's terrible. What's going on is horrible, in my opinion. But I can't answer your question. I can't answer any more like it. I'm not allowed to answer the questions unless I am instructed to do so by the head of my department. Because the Eisenhower letter was that nobody should give any information to members of Congress in these hearings unless the instructions to do so came, I believe, originally direct from the White House, but that was soon interpreted as meaning from the White House through the heads of departments or the executive heads. Anyway, the effect of the orders soon came to be understood that any communist in government brought before a committee like the House Committee on Un-American Activities no longer had to plead the Fifth Amendment or the First Amendment or anything else at all. All he had to do was to say, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I should like to answer your questions, but I'm not allowed to do so unless I'm instructed to answer them by the head of my department. And after a few efforts of that, they quit. They quit completely. You can go back and look at the record and it may surprise you. There's been no effort whatsoever to expose communists in government since 1955. And we know from James Barnum's Web of Subversion and from a lot of other things how strong that influence was already by 54. And you know also how much it's been growing and increasing ever since then. So this is why you've got such communist influence so high up in so many areas of government today that it's just, even people try to tell you the truth and people of great influence, you just don't believe them. Communist sympathies and even actual communist subversion were already then being made daily more respectable by the actions of our government, of our great universities, much of our press, and by the complacency of our people. And it would have been very easy to go on with specific factual illustrations and instances, even then, as it certainly would be easier today, of this spreading, deepening communist influence for hours, and of its visible results in the events of the past preceding years, both at home and abroad. But this is not the occasion to do so, so let me simply move ahead to an appraisal of communist progress here at home. In other words, an appraisal of their progress within this third step. Let me point out first, if you'll forgive me, what I claim to be some of my qualifications for offering any such appraisal. They are not based simply on my reading of anti-communist literature, although I have tried to do my homework as well as I could in that respect. Nor are they based on my acquaintance and exchange of views with other anti-communists primarily, even though I've tried to learn all I could from those sources too. I went to Korea some 9 or 10 years ago now, 1955. I went to Korea and had quite a good visit with Syngman Rhee, who became my good friend and remained my good friend not until he died, because he was unfortunately out of his mind for the last year or more before he died, but until he did lose his mind in a heartbreak contrived by people in our government. I'll even mention a name here, primarily by Christian Herter, who did more than any other one man to undermine Syngman Rhee and bring about the events that broke his heart and caused him to die with his mind gone. I went to Formosa, where I talked with President Chiang in his office in Taipei. A very nice visit with him, and I had tea and a long conversation with Madam Chiang at her home up on Yangmin Chen, Green Mountain. Long discussions with practically every top official in the Chinese nationalist government, many of whom became good friends of mine. Some of them still are, although some of my best friends there have since gone, one way or another. The man I thought most of, next to Chiang, was Chen Cheng. I had a great admiration for Chen Cheng. I spent quite a bit of time with him. He was the vice president, you remember, who died just about a year ago. I went to Germany, 1956, talked with Dr. Adenauer, and could tell you a very interesting story about the report I wrote of my visit with him when I came back, and one thing that he didn't want to have published because it would embarrass our State Department. And I have been regularly in touch with quite a few others of the best-informed anti-communist leaders and scholars throughout the world. But, ladies and gentlemen, my real justification for asking you to give any weight or pay any attention to the opinions I'm going to offer here is my study of the communists' own literature. For that's where you go really to learn the truth. In their weeklies, such as The Worker and The National Guardian, in their monthlies, such as the New World Review and Political Affairs, you learn from their own mouths what they have accomplished in the past that they consider most important, how they did it, what they're trying to do now, and by what means. And you learn what they consider most important in their objectives for the immediate future. For instance, back in around 1953 and 4, when people were trying to tell you, parroting the communist line without knowing it, that McCarthy was really helping the communists. And by his extremism and all of this, that it was really helping the communists, and they loved it because it helped to destroy any real anti-communism. All you had to do was to go to the communists' own press and find out that there was nothing in the world as important to the communists as getting rid of McCarthy. He really was a danger to them. It's my opinion that in 1952 or 3, if the communists had been asked and been willing to tell truthfully which one they had rather have destroyed and got rid of, Chiang Kai-shek or Franco or McCarthy, there'd been no question that it was Senator McCarthy. It represented a greater danger to them. And it was perfectly clear in their own work materials, and yet you got all this business about how he was helping them from the nonsense that was being parroted in the liberal press of America. So I have tried to read the communist press pretty thoroughly over the years when I had a chance to find out a lot of things. They have to lay the line out, you see, for their own people. After all, you got 40 million. They can't pass everything all the way down the line by conspiratorial methods to 40 million people. They lay it out in other ways for the people to pick up. And the ones who are smart enough to pick it up from it just being laid out in front of them, the communist press, are the ones that get ahead. And they do this with completely confident that because their control of our mass media of communication is now so great, only such parts of that line will reach the American people as the communists themselves wish, and to the extent that they wish. On the basis primarily, therefore, of this long-continued study, but with the benefit of other studies and investigations and contacts too, I ventured this opinion in 1958. It was an honest opinion then, concurred in by all of the well-informed anti-communist observers that I knew, except that many of the best informed and most scholarly and penetrating of these observers thought that my appraisal was consistently too low with regard to our own country. And I'll come back to that later in another connection. But this opinion was that at that time the communists had already gone more than 25% of the way towards completely taking over our own country, the United States, and with it the rest of the world. I think maybe I better explain how we arrive at those figures and what they mean. Here's what we call the scoreboard issue. We published the first one in 1958. We published one every year since. And in the middle of it, we give a scoreboard for every country in the world. The scores are given in percentages of 100, pretty much in brackets of 20%. In other words, 0 to 20, or 10 to 30, or 20 to 40, 30 to 50, and so forth. We are very careful to point out what we mean. There's been some rather dirty, deliberate, purposeful misunderstandings of what we are saying on the part of some of the press. I'll mention the most ridiculous one in a minute. But anyway, what we mean is this, that if you take in any country the communist influence, say, in government, and the communist influence in education, which may be quite different, more or less, communist influence in labor, communist influence in finance. If you take all the communist influence in all the divisions of national life and make a weighted balance, it will give you that influence as a certain percentage of total control. In other words, a country like Formosa has been 0 to 20. All the communist influence at work in Formosa would not represent up to 20% of control of what Formosa does, nationalist China. And you take for Soviet Russia, it's 100%. You take for other countries in between, it varies. Now, these figures are put together Originally, I did the first tentative list, but I never sent it to these people. We had people on 5 continents. We have them on 6 continents today. And there'd be people like a former ambassador from some country to our country. In one case, one of our own former ambassadors to another country. In one case, an American businessman, a very able one, who has spent 20 years on another continent representing American industry there. He's just retired, unfortunately, so he's not going to be able to help us again. But anyway, there are now 8 of these men. And they, in general, don't even know each other, or know who each other are. We make up a tentative list, we list the countries, and that's not too easy today because the boundaries and the countries and the autonomies change so rapidly that you'll have 107 countries one year and 112 the next and 108 the next and back and forth. I pity the map makers, the geography publishers. But we make up a tentative list and we send it off to these people all over the world and ask them to send back. And the amazing thing, ladies and gentlemen, is the consistency with which these figures agree with each other on the part of these men. There has been almost no variation. As I said just now, the one variation has been no variation with their figures or with mine. The one variation has been that their figures were constantly higher with regard to our own country. When we were insisting that the figure, which was in our first scoreboard of 1958, was between 20 and 40%. That's why I said, let's take 25. It was more than take 25 as a minimum. They said it was too low. And as we went further along, they insisted it was too low. When we got up to 30 to 50%, there was a lot of argument. At 40 to 60, there was a lot of argument. And we got to 50 to 70. We stayed there for 3 years. Not that the communist influence wasn't growing, but some of the understanding and awakening and so forth was also growing to offset it. There's been an argument that we were too low with regard to the figure for our own country, and it's been the only disagreement we've had. I'd like to say, too, that never yet have there been any developments to show that we were over on any country. We have been under once or twice where there were things going on in some country moving faster under the surface than we realized, where our figure was too low. And the jump had to be fairly fast to bring it up. It was true with regard to the Dominican Republic when Trujillo was assassinated. Our figures showed communist influence in the Dominican Republic too low. We've never yet had one that has been shown to be too high. Well, this is listed for all the countries of the world. This is the 1965 scoreboard. We said then we were going to publish one every year until the battle was won or was lost, was over. And we have. Now, with regard to the United States, in the first scoreboard in 1958, our figure was 20 to 40%. And I said, here, let's say that at least 25% would be correct. The point is that I want to make a total appraisal here. So just to be doubly on the safe side, as of 1958 first, then we put the figure for the United States at 25%. And that meant, of course, for the whole third step for the rest of the world. So the simple arithmetic of the situation was as follows. Let's call each of these 3 steps 1. And their total 3. Now the communists had already accomplished all of the first step, Eastern Europe, which is 1 complete, plus even by 58, 3/4 of the second step, the mass and masses of Asia, plus 1/4 of the third. So 1 plus 3/4 plus 1/4 adds up to 2 out of that total of 3. And my point was, which I tried to hammer home as emphatically and convincingly as I could, that not to believe in 1958 that the communists were already over 2/3 of the way towards carrying out their total program, or that they were not then moving at an accelerated pace and with increased momentum to finish the job, was to close our eyes to the plain facts as surely as did the good people of Czechoslovakia in 1948, and with the same ultimately fatal results. Now, as of today, the score with regard to Eastern Europe is still 1. 1 out of 1 for all practical purposes. Greece had been held out a little while. Istanbul, Greece is now, you can see what's going on. The communists riots that will put up with nothing except their way. No matter what's offered, it's got to go on further. The figure there is 1. With regard to the second step, the communists have not pushed their police state down too much yet. They have definitely increased their power, even their visible power, in many parts of Asia. And you know what's been happening in Indochina. You may not be aware of how much the South Korea is being taken over by the communists. And Japan looked worse 2 or 3 years ago even than today, but maybe I'm afraid that's because we aren't looking as close to what's really happening. I would say nevertheless that the figure has not gone up as much from that point, and that's natural. Once the communists get that close, they don't particularly want to. I think the figure, a legitimate figure for Asia today, all of Asia, would be 80%. For the third step, the rest of the world and the United States, I put down here 0.6 of 1, or 60%. Our score for the United States this year is 60 to 80. It's created considerable furor and argument. What we are saying is that the communists now, if they combine their influence, and you make a weighted average of it, of their influence in Washington, in our government, all over the world, in labor, education, everywhere else, that they are exercising what is 60 to 80% of control of everything we do as a nation. Nothing to do with how many communists there are. Nothing to do with any police state. That's a different matter. What is their percentage of control of what this country does? And we think it's definitely between 60 and 80%. It's rather amazing things about the figures. These experts all knew from past arguments that I wanted to keep the figure very conservative. We'd had it 50 to 70. And they knew that when we started, for 3 years, when we started to move it up from 50 to 70 further up, they figured there was going to be an argument. So they all wrote letters or wrote notes. There's a lot of discussion. And it was amazing how uniform they were in pinpointing it. They said the figure today is 70%. One of them said it's 65 to 75. You can pinpoint it that close. The other one says it's got to move up to 60 to 80. The other guy says, heck, why argue? It's 70%. And the whole consensus, the whole panel was agreed that the figure was 70%. So we could stay 50 to 70, but it'd be intellectually dishonest because we're staying right at the top edge instead of presenting as it should be. So we moved it to 60 to 80, and that's what it means. Now you'd have to study what these fellows are studying quite a while to see how they can come that close. But nevertheless, that is the figure. That's what they believe, that the percentage is 60 to 80%. We've had some interesting endorsements of our figures. About 3 years ago, a Catholic priest showed up in my office one morning. I'd never heard of him before. Came in and sent his, the girl brought his name in, and I got him to come in my office to talk. He introduced himself. He was from Singapore. He'd been in Singapore for years. He's back to this country. He was an American, and he'd heard about us, and he wanted to talk to us. He wanted to see what we were doing. So we talked for quite a little while. And I finally said, well, Father, you've been in Singapore. I'd like to ask you a question. And I explained the scoreboard, what our scoreboard meant. And I said, now, without my telling you, I want you to tell me, under those conditions, what it means, what figure you would give for Singapore. And he stopped and thought a while, and he said, 80%. I showed him the figures. They were 70 to 90. That was our bracket, and this is a man who'd been there for years. It's not too hard. You can tell just about how far it's gone, so the figures do mean something. So, today, we've got down here, just to give a new figure, for the third step in the whole rest of the world, counting everything, I've got 6/10. In other words, the communists are exercising 60% of control over what the United States and the other nations do. And I think that's conservative on the low side. But anyway, if you take and add them up, you got 1 plus 8/10 of 1 plus 6/10 of 1 is equal to 2.4 out of 3. And 2.4 out of 3 is, my mind is 4/5, is 80%. And I will repeat that not to believe that the communists have now gone, you translate this into another meaning now, have now gone 80% of their way towards their whole, completing their whole total job of taking over the planet is to be utterly and entirely unrealistic. They have, ladies and gentlemen. Their actual steps of implementation of this power into police-state regimentation and police-state brutality are already in the incipient tentative stages, even in the United States right now. And ladies and gentlemen, a little tiny bit yet, not nearly as much as what de Gaulle is doing in France. De Gaulle is going a long ways with a knock on the door, and has been. He even got one prison with 11,000 people in it, in cells about 6 by 6.5. And I can tell you quite some stories of some of the things that are happening in France that we know from personal knowledge of the people, what the French people go on. They don't know it. But here you don't have anything like that yet, but you do have the incipient beginnings of a police state just faintly beginning to take hold here. But the point is, the communists have gone 80% of the way in completing this job. And ladies and gentlemen, let me repeat that if the United States falls to the communists, they then have the whole world completely in their tyrannical hands, and our whole civilization, if this tyranny lasts very long, if they have it in their hands very long, our whole civilization will be destroyed. I was talking about the misinterpretation of our scoreboards and what they mean. Life magazine a few years ago, and they ran a long, vicious article about me in it, and yet the 10 or 11 pages in the article, the total effect wasn't too bad. They also ran an editorial, a whole full-page editorial. And to give you an idea of how nasty it was and how incredibly false it was, they quoted, in quotes, had me saying that there were 40 million communists in the United States. Actually, we were talking about communists in government. I was talking about how high up there are and how many there are. But the percentage is still small. I mean, I'm utterly convinced that the communists do not have anywhere near 2% of our federal employees. And of course, the communists control any group, any organization, any population, any nation, any committee with 3%. They know what they're doing, and the others don't. But they do have to have about 3%, and for an industrial nation like America, they need 3%. They haven't got 2% in the federal government. I don't think they have 1% in education, in the whole total. I'll go back to that later. The higher up you go, the higher the percentage is elsewhere. But anyway, the Life magazine said that I said that there was 40 million communists in the United States, which is the kind of falsehoods we have to face in this fight. Just one thing, I mentioned de Gaulle's prison camp, and somebody asked me later the particular one I was referring to, where it was, and I couldn't remember. So I looked it up at lunch, and it's at Ardoise. Wherever Ardoise is, I can't tell you. I have a vague recollection that it's in the south of France. It may be all the way down the Mediterranean or something, because I have a vague recollection that the actual full name is Ardoise-sur-la-Mer, or something like that. We did finish one part of this look at the score division of the presentation, and I arrived at, as my opinion, that it showed the communists had gone about 80% of the road that they have been marching right straight down since Lenin laid it out for them in 1922 or 3, before he died in January of 24. And now let's look very briefly at a different kind of scoreboard, measuring the same communist advance. At the last get-together of international communism before World War II, this was in 1937. And the reason I picked this in 1958 with these notes was that the other end of this line had just taken place the year before in 57, so that the latest figures that were concrete and available, it still makes an excellent illustration of what I'm talking about, so let's let the period stay. At the last get-together before World War II, the total membership figure of communists in the world represented at this gathering in Moscow was 4 million. They had 4 million communists in 1937, worldwide. But in November 1957, just 20 years later, at the triumphant meeting in Moscow to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, in 1917, at this meeting in November 57, there were 75 communist parties which could be officially counted from that many different countries and areas of the world, with a total membership of 33 million. Now, this was approximately from 1937 to 57, an 800% increase in the 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, that is just about the rate of growth of communist power throughout the world in that time during those 20 years, no matter how you look at it or with what unit of appraisal you measure it. An 800% increase. And there's a rather funny coincidence in that connection that at first strikes you as amazing that there should be any such thing. The long arm of coincidence could reach so far until it finally dawns on you that probably it's not coincidence at all. There's a cause and effect. If you will take the different statistical reports for the United States and look them up, the amount of the national debt, the amount of taxes, the number of employees in the federal bureaucracy, total civilian employees, and everything else that more or less measures the quantity of government, you'd be amazed to find how many of them expanded just about 800% in those 20 years. Just about the same degree of expansion. And you say, what an amazing coincidence, till you realize that isn't coincidence. Who the heck do you think was paying for this expansion of communism by 800% in those 20 years? Not only paying in money, but paying in all kinds of other ideological and spiritual ways. We were. The United States government was financing the whole thing. And you have about an 800% expansion of all of these measurements of the extent and degree and quantity of government during those same 20 years. Now let's study quickly one more and final scoreboard, perhaps the most revealing of them all. Here it is. Since August 1945, the communists have averaged taking over approximately 7,000 newly enslaved subjects every hour. Now, of course, we are dealing with averages because frequently nobody can say exactly when the communists did take over a country. With regard to Hungary, for instance, we know simply that in the middle of 1945, Hungary did not belong to the Soviets. They began establishing themselves as a part of the Hungarian government at the end of the war, and through murders, treason, and all other typical communist tactics, by 1949, the communists were in complete control. So it would be correct to say that the approximately 10 million inhabitants of Hungary had been added to the total of communist enslaved peoples during those 4 years. And by 49, they belonged to the total. Or look at Indonesia. In 1945, Indonesia certainly did not belong to the communists. But by 1960, it most assuredly did. So your 80 million people there had been added during those 15 years. So we're dealing with averages, but still the averages are correct as to the average number of people who have been enslaved by the communists per hour. Now, please remember, too, that these people taken over by the communists, whether they have been in Indonesia or Hungary or Iraq or Korea, are not, as is a tendency to feel, it's promoted somewhat by the communists themselves, they are not a different breed of animals from ourselves. They think of concentration camps with the same despairing horror. They have the same love for their families. And individually, they feel the same pain under torture as do you and I. So, with those things in mind, let me now repeat the statement. On the average, 7,000 more human beings, just like you and me, have been brought under the incredibly brutal rule of a communist police state every hour, 24 hours of every day, 365 days of every year for the past 20 years. The darkness of police state rule, ladies and gentlemen, has been and is closing over this planet of ours very fast. Now, please note that the communists have not made, especially since 1945, any of this immense progress by the direct use of force. They have beguiled Chinese into fighting Chinese, Koreans into fighting Koreans, Vietnamese into fighting the French and each other, the Israelis, British, and French into fighting Egyptians, and the Algerians into fighting the French. They have even maneuvered Americans into fighting Chinese communists in Korea, with the Americans' hands tied behind their backs. But since 1945, not one Russian regiment has ever taken part in any of this imperialistic advance except in the suppression of rebellion in already conquered territory, as in Hungary. The communists have put over these tremendous gains by bluff and bluster, lies and deception, murder, and above all, far beyond all other means, by treason within other governments, and by diplomatic measures based on all of these other means. And that lamp of experience certainly should guide us as to what they're up to today. Now, there are three possible methods. Here, as in many cases, I'm just following the exact 1958 notes. It was true then, it's still true. There were three possible methods by which the communists might take us over. One would be through a sufficient amount of infiltration and propaganda to disguise communism as just another political party, and thus to get enough known, recognized, admitted communist agents and sympathizers into positions of power in our government to enable them to seize formal power by a peaceful coup d'etat, as they did in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. Now, we have never anticipated that development. It's too difficult in this country, and not their best approach. The second method would be by fomenting internal civil war in this country and aiding the communist side in that war with all necessary might. Now, this is, of course, the method they used in China. But in the long struggle in China, the Kremlin was handicapped by the need for keeping its own intervention from being accurately understood and appraised by other nations. By the time the Soviet rulers ever came to apply this plan to our country, there obviously would be no compelling reason for them to hold back in any way. Only up to the time that a full-scale, nationwide civil war was underway would the deception of the American people have to be maintained. Once they were all in an all-out civil war, there's nobody to hide it from. The communists could throw all of their force and drive and power into the picture. And it seems clear from all of their past history, as well as from the nature of the beast, that despite their vaunted missiles and bombs, the Soviets would not attempt military conquest of so powerful and so extensive a country as the United States without availing themselves of a sufficiently strong fifth column in our midst. A fifth column which could provide the sabotage, the false leadership, and the sudden seizures of power and of means of communication needed to convert the struggle from the very beginning into a civil war rather than a clear-cut war with an external enemy. The horror and cruelty which would be made possible by such planned confusion, exactly of the kind, on an immense scale, exactly of the kind that faced the peasants in the Oriental hills of Cuba in the fall of 1958. And Castro's men wore no uniforms, and nobody could tell who was enemy and who was friend. The kind of thing that man was supposed to have outgrown 2,000 years ago, at least, or more. Fighting a war without uniform. The very thing for which Castro was so glorified by the Reader's Digest as late as April 1958, that he fought his war without uniforms. Shows how people swallow it, can be misled. Probably, in my mind, the greatest crime and horror ever committed by Castro was fighting a civil war in the Oriental hills with the peasants there when nobody could tell who was their enemy and who was their friend. Well, you'd have the same thing in this country, ladies and gentlemen, on a far wider scale. The horror and cruelty which would be made possible by such planned confusion is something to contemplate. And, as we said in the very first issue of our magazine, American Opinion, we could foresee a possibility of the Kremlin taking this gamble following this second route in time. In fact, this is the explanation of the racial turmoil that's going on today. I'm going to take here, and because it fits in, and come back later to the third and more important method. I'm going to take, at this point, take the time to go into the civil rights situation at some little length, if you will let me. For the civil rights movement in the United States, with all of its growing agitation and riots and bitterness and insidious steps towards the appearance of a civil war, this civil rights movement has not been infiltrated by the communists, as you now frequently hear. It has been deliberately and almost wholly created by the communists, patiently building up to this present stage for more than 40 years. The record to support this statement is absolutely clear to anybody who will take the trouble to study, honestly and objectively, the history of communist activities with regard to what the communists themselves early named the American Negro problem. In this long endeavor, the communists have faithfully followed two of their major and time-tested formulas. They use the same kind, I repeat over and over, formulas over and over again, big ones, little ones, and so forth. They've used two major formulas here. First has been the formula known as anti-colonialism. This begins with the basic pretense that communism is an uprising of the downtrodden masses against powerful bosses who exploit them. This premise, in turn, is 100% falsehood. Communism is entirely an effort of a self-perpetuating clique of international gangsters, usually out of the very top economic, educational, and political circles of each country, to impose their tyranny rigidly and completely on the whole world. Now, derived from this fundamental big lie is the theme of anti-colonialism. Its specific core of falsehood has been that the colonial peoples of Asia and Africa wanted and deserved their, quote, independence, unquote, from the nations of Europe which were oppressing and exploiting them. Actually, by 1920, the French in Indochina, or Algeria, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Belgians in the Congo, and other imperialistic powers were giving their colonial subjects a very enlightened and benevolent rule indeed. The level of education, the exercise of individual freedom and responsibility, and the participation of the natives in their own local governments as rapidly as these advances of civilization could be absorbed. Now, this process was not primarily the result of altruism. It developed automatically from a realistic self-interest and from the commercial progress in colonial areas which was being promoted by pioneers from the mother countries. But as a consequence of the total forces at work, the natives were coming more and more to regard themselves as loyal members of those great empires of which Paris or Brussels or The Hague might be the capital. There was no more spontaneous demand or natural desire for, quote, independence, unquote, among any of those colonial peoples in 1920 than there was among American Negroes in 1955. So the communists had to create in each colony the appearance of such a demand and the semblance of a civil war on behalf of, quote, independence, unquote. Have done so in one colonial area after another through terrorizing enough natives by atrocities and massacres into supporting or appearing to support communist guerrilla leaders in their clamor for independence. Eventually, in this way, the synthetic and prolonged, quote, civil war, unquote, could furnish the excuse for communists in the top circles of various governments and in the United Nations to negotiate the colony into independence, always as a transition stage towards its becoming a colony of the Soviets. And probably more hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings have been brutally tortured and murdered as a means of creating this appearance of a native civil war for independence than for any other purpose in human history. Let's look briefly at Algeria for an excellent case history. In 1954, there were in Algeria approximately 8 million native Muslims, 1,250,000 French settlers or descendants of French settlers. They'd been going over there, you remember, since about 1830. Finest Frenchmen there were, pioneer stock, pioneer type, mental type, had done a terrifically good job in Algeria for those 5 generations or more. And anyway, there were the 1,250,000 French settlers or descendants of French settlers, and 250,000 Jews. many of whom or whose ancestors had also come from France. And parenthetically, this last fact proved eventually to be of considerable value to the anti-communist cause. For few developments have served more effectively to wake up intelligent Jews in other countries to the realities of communism as against the falsehoods being fed to them than what happened to their co-religionists in Algeria. Close parenthesis. French citizens with pioneer instincts had been moving across the Mediterranean into Algeria since 1830. You can see I forget what's in my notes sometimes and get ahead of myself. They had carried with them the purposes, knowledge, and methods needed to convert this northern edge of the Sahara Desert into a great commercial and civilized part of the French Empire, which it had become. And they were rapidly integrating the native Muslims into every phase of this happy development. Algeria was not even technically a colony, as were Tunisia or Guinea, but consisted legally of several additional departments of France itself. The Muslim natives had come to regard themselves as French and were increasingly proud of being a part of the French nation. Don't forget that one of the leading Muslims, Bashar Abu Elam, was the vice president of the French Senate. This was an integral part of France, exactly as the South, which is what I'm coming to, is an integral part of the United States today. And as late as 1954, there were not 5% of the total population of Algeria who had the slightest interest in forming an independent country of their own, any more than there are 5% of the American Negroes with any such interest today. But the time had come when it fitted into overall communist plans to apply the anti-colonialism strategy to this area, Algeria. So a murderous guerrilla band was formed under a communist criminal named Ben Bella and was given the high-sounding title of the Federation for National Liberation, FLN. Then the standard formula, which lies at the center of this communist strategy, was put to work. Enough natives had to be persuaded by propaganda or terrorized by atrocities or impelled by the combination into supporting this national liberation movement or into appearing to do so to give some semblance of a civil war. And the FLN campaign for that purpose developed into guerrilla activities averaging some 20 atrocities per day for the next 7 years. You never read a thing about it in your newspapers. Now, of course, the French government, under fully as much communist influence as ours is under now, was in many ways a clandestine partner to the actions and purposes of the FLN. So the people of France were told by government and press about atrocities being perpetrated by the FLN in Algeria on the French settlers there and on French army personnel. Just as you're going to hear in the South later about the atrocities perpetrated on the southern white people, especially the wealthy ones, you won't hardly hear at all of the 10 or 20 times as many atrocities being perpetrated on the Negroes themselves, to terrorize them into being afraid to oppose this thing. The people of France were told by government press about atrocities being perpetrated by the FLN in Algeria on the French settlers there and on French army personnel. These would seem to be the actions, of course, of a revolutionary people, almost fanatically fighting for their independence. Neither the French people nor the American people and the rest of the world were allowed to learn that practically the total effort of the FLN guerrillas in Algeria was spent in afflicting atrocities on their fellow Muslims who wanted no part of any such revolution, for this would have given the show away. In time, these pro-communist forces in France made their one big mistake of sending Jacques Soustelle to Algeria as Governor General. Because of his extremely liberal and pro-de Gaulle background, it was assumed that Soustelle would be entirely sympathetic to the FLN, as he clearly was when he first took up his new duties. His attitude seems to have been about as follows. Well, it is certainly too bad that these revolutionary troops are killing French army officers. But after all, they are seeking the independence of their country, and the French army is the force preventing that independence, so what can you expect? And it is too bad that these revolutionary troops should be killing some French settlers. But these settlers undoubtedly have a feudal attitude that stands in the way of independence, so who can blame the FLN? You cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs, nor achieve the independence of a nation without shedding blood. But Jacques Soustelle, and may I say that I'm making up things for him here, but I have talked with Soustelle at some length twice, and I know him fairly well, and I don't think that I'm out of line in expressing, just from his own written material, how he felt. Jacques Soustelle happened to be intellectually honest, despite being a very liberal. And in the course of a very few months, he discovered, to his amazement, certain incontrovertible truths about the whole situation that had been unknown to him and to most of the people in France. These included the following. One, there was no revolutionary force in Algeria that amounted to anything in a military sense. The FLN could be completely wiped out by the French army there at any time the army was instructed or even allowed to do so. In fact, the FLN was practically wiped out on several occasions, but was promptly restored as a guerrilla force through reinforcements kept in Morocco or Tunisia by Moscow for that purpose. Two, the atrocities which the FLN were able to inflict on French army personnel were relatively few and far between. They consisted primarily of the occasional capture of some detached individual officer who would then be deliberately crippled and maimed and carted around the countryside in a slatted cage too small for his body so that he could never stretch his tortured muscles. This was to show the natives the supposed contempt of the FLN for the French army and what might happen to anybody who opposed the FLN. Three, the atrocities which the FLN perpetrated on the French settlers were also comparatively few because the FLN did not have the force to get at these victims through the protection provided by the French army and the loyal natives. The FLN was primarily capable of sudden hit-and-run attacks on isolated native villages. One of their particular attacks is a good illustration. They took a village of about 400 people, and they had tried to impress a few of the adult young men there into one of their guerrilla bands, and they wouldn't go along. They wouldn't do it. So they came in at dawn and killed every male, from a baby 1 day old to a man 92 or 3. Just every male in the village, they killed them. They didn't resort to torture this time. They just killed them. Didn't touch a woman. Didn't touch a girl, baby girl to a woman 90 at all. Just killed every male. They always are dealing with psychological values. The point here is you're in a country where there are very few newspapers, and most of the natives couldn't read, even very small radio, and most news is by word of mouth and the grapevine. And in the Arab world, it can travel very fast. And this is the kind of dramatic thing, of great interest and horror, that of course would lend itself to transmission. You can be sure that there wasn't a native Muslim within 100 miles of that village 24 hours later that didn't know about it. They'd come in and killed every single one of some 200 males and left the 200 females utterly untouched. They were perpetrating all kinds of atrocities like this for 7 years, as I say, an average of about 20 a day. To go back to the things that Soustelle discovered as his eyes were opened. 4. The numerous and cruel atrocities of the FLN, quote, revolutionaries, unquote, which constituted almost their whole occupation, were inflicted on their fellow native Muslims for the purpose we have indicated above. 5. There was no real sentiment for revolution, nor for independence, nor for separation from France among the native population at all, except as the communists were able to coerce and simulate such sentiment through their threats, pressures, and cruelties. 6. The opposition to the FLN and loyalty to France among the native Muslims, wherever they had the opportunity to show that loyalty or the strength to stand in opposition, as among the 30,000 tightly knit followers of one famous Muslim leader, the Bashar Abu Alam, were overwhelming. 7. But the pretense that this was honestly a civil war for, quote, freedom and independence, unquote, the maintenance of a provisional revolutionary government of Algeria under Nasser's wing in Cairo, these and all other parts of the great deception were being maintained in order to support the propaganda and diplomatic pressures throughout the world, and especially in and through the United Nations, for Algerian independence. This independence, meaning the turning of Algeria over to the communist rule of the FLN regime under Ben Bella, this, quote, independence, unquote, was to be won, as it eventually was won, by negotiations. Exactly as Vietnam was sold out in 1954, by negotiation. And these negotiations were to be made plausible, or at least possible, through these spurious claims given substance only by terror. As a result of these discoveries and revelations, Soustelle soon became the most determined and powerful fighter for keeping Algeria French and against the communist capture of this, quote, colony, unquote. But it was too late, and the total forces against him were too strong. Members of the international communist conspiracy in the United Nations, in Moscow, in the French government, and in our government, all working in smooth concert and each one knowing exactly what he was doing, while confusing everybody else by deception within deception and pretense on top of pretense, these had all resistance too completely stymied and under control. Eventually, tens of thousands of the finest officers and men in the French army, seeing themselves being deliberately betrayed by de Gaulle, took the desperate step of forming the OAS, Secret Army Organization, to try to save Algeria from communist hands. But their leader, General Salan, was too patriotic to carry this struggle to metropolitan France itself. I believe that Salan could readily have overthrown de Gaulle, but it would have meant civil war, and goodness knows what happened. Salan wanted no part of it, for good reasons. His idea was to save Algeria from the communists, and he knew that the native Muslims and his men, followers, could do that. What he didn't realize, that de Gaulle was going to take the whole power of the French army that followed the discipline route, however reluctantly, and use it on the side of the FLN to destroy Salan, which he did. Instead of Salan having to save Algeria from the communists, he had to save it from the communists, and de Gaulle, all the power de Gaulle could throw there on the side of the communists. Oh, I've got ahead my notes again. De Gaulle used that major part of the French army, which, however reluctantly and bitterly, still followed the rule of discipline, to help the FLN to destroy the OAS. Just as the administration in Washington is visibly using and planning to use the United States Army to whatever extent necessary to suppress opposition to the leaders of the Negro revolutionary movement in the South. Some of the things our government is doing right now in the South to help the Negro revolutionary movement in incredible illegalities is terrific. To go back to Algeria for a minute, and de Gaulle and his fellow communists finally carried out their aim at Evian of negotiating all of Algeria into the communist hands of Ben Bella's FLN, and doing it, negotiating it into his hands as a supposedly, quote, free and independent, unquote, nation. Then began those continuous tortures and cruel massacres of tens of thousands of the Harkis. These were the native Algerian Muslims, including members of the local police forces, who had been most faithful to France. Of which terror to these Harkis, incidentally, you've read practically nothing in your American press. Now, this is simply a preview of what the NRM, the Negro Revolutionary Movement, will do to the people of the South, both white and black, but especially the blacks, who oppose their treasonous movement if and when they succeed in setting up their free and independent Negro Soviet Republic out of our southern states. I might say, because of something I passed, that right now, in one case, it's happening in Marcus, Georgia, the agents of the federal government are going around for the federal government with your tax money in mind, disguised as going through a certain agency, and bailing out all the Negroes that have been arrested for crimes in the civil disturbances there, putting up the bail for them. That's right on the records. They're doing other things like it all over the South. Going back again to the Algerian picture, also to be noted as of great importance, I might say that this not only has been admitted, but the man working for the federal government doing it admitted that this was also something new for the federal government to be in. I'd say it's quite new, but that's right on the record. The various steps and developments over several years by which this complete betrayal of a part of France was ultimately accomplished were such that the final result served as a terrific demoralization to the anti-communist leadership and boost to the communist forces in metropolitan France itself. The specific revolution in Algeria was made to serve as a vital part of the broader proletarian revolution being conducted by the French communists at home. The anti-colonialism racket in and with regard to Algeria had not only made a communist colony out of this former French, quote, colony, unquote, but had tremendously undermined the mother country as well. And this should be kept vividly in mind in connection with the two simultaneous revolutions which the communists actually boast that they are now carrying on within the United States. For the final step in this anti-colonialism development, which really brings it home to ourselves, is the concept, apparently originated by Stalin, that the Negroes in the southeastern United States could be treated as an oppressed colony, with the same agitation among them on behalf of their independence and self-determination as any other oppressed colony. This line was officially laid down in 1928 in a communist pamphlet called American Negro Problems, which was written and distributed as instructions to the American communists by Stalin's agent, Joseph Pogačar, who had earlier been one of the top men in the incredibly cruel but short-lived communist regime in Hungary under Béla Kun. And there's almost nothing being done, ladies and gentlemen, in the whole civil rights movement in America today, which is not exactly in accord with the agitation and propaganda program set forth in that booklet by this Hungarian communist murderer, Joseph Pogačar. B. But a second formula has also been at work and has always been predominant in this whole civil rights strive. For in the opening paragraph of the very pamphlet discussed above, and incidentally may I say that we have reprinted that, as many of you know, by offset, so there can be no question of a change of a comma or anything. The exact pamphlet distributed by Pogačar in 1928, we have available at 10 copies for $1 from American Opinion, and the other famous pamphlet that is the basis of all of this, which was Ford and Allen's 1934 booklet on the Negroes in the Soviet America. We've also reprinted by offset exact. It's available at 3 copies for $1. The second formula has been predominant, for in the opening paragraph of the very pamphlet discussed above, establishing the anti-colonialism theme for agitation among the Negroes in America, there was this italicized sentence. They italicized it in the first paragraph. Quote, "The struggle against white oppression of the Negro masses is a part of the proletarian revolution in America against capitalism." There's their own statement that everything they're doing is part of an attempt to overthrow capitalism. Unquote. So the more general formula at work behind what the communists call their Negro revolutionary movement is simply the process of adapting every possible bit of agitation and propaganda, even for the most specialized aims, to the service of their general purpose of gradual subversion of the American system. Now, the communists soft pedal the theme of Formula A, self-determination, separate Negro Soviet Republic, whenever and to whatever extent it might damage the working of Formula B, the straight overall proletarian revolution. For every promise to the Negroes, every use made of the racial problem, every iota of bleeding heart sympathy created over supposed or even real injustices to the Negroes, these things are all subservient in communist plans to their one great goal of fastening the police state tyranny of a central government over the American people. The communists say that the exact boundaries of the Negro Soviet Republic are undetermined, but that, as announced nearly 40 years ago, it's right in Pogačar's book, the booklet, quote, "It would be certain to include such cities as Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, Atlanta, Augusta, Savannah and Macon, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee." They make clear that this, quote, "promise of liberation," unquote, to the Negroes is simply one of the means of Sovietizing all of what is now the United States. A careful study quickly reveals that every part of the civil rights program has been designed and is being carried forward as a step in the communist strategy for these purposes. And the current leaders of the nationwide civil rights campaign have such extensive records of affiliating with communists, of hiring communists, of being guided, trained, and supported by communists, and of themselves supporting communist agents and causes, as to make their real purposes as obvious as sunrise to anybody who will simply use honestly the intelligence that God gave him. The same intelligence will also grasp that the American Negroes as a whole did not plan this, have not wanted any part of it, and are no bigger dupes in yielding to the propaganda and coercion of the comsimps among them than are the white people of the United States in swallowing the portions of that propaganda which are labeled idealism. The communists could never take over one nation after another with only about 3% of the population belonging to the conspiracy, as they repeatedly do, and by using the same formulas over and over, unless they could deceive huge segments of the other 97% into doing most of their many different jobs for them. Civil rights is a perfect example of communist strategy, that's in quotes, civil rights, is a perfect example of communist strategy and communist tactics at work, so far successfully, in making an anti-communist people help to fasten the tiny but almost infinite chains of a central communist tyranny around their bodies and their lives. And we think it is time for our fellow citizens, white and black, throughout the whole United States, to wake up to the real meaning of what is happening all around us. For it is not too late, with sufficient understanding, to restore order and goodwill and the governmental principles of our once great republic and the gradual progress we had been making before the communists began their insidious destruction towards a still better framework for human life on the part of individuals of all races, colors, and creeds than man has ever achieved before. Yet this civil turmoil is certainly a powerful auxiliary to the communist plans for taking over the United States. Although, in my opinion, and this will take us back to our main track again, although, in my opinion, it is only an assist to the main drive for that purpose, which is the takeover of America. The civil rights movement, as extensive and vicious and cruel as it is merely auxiliary. This plan has been and is the conversion of the United States into a socialist nation, quite similar to Russia itself in its economy and political outlook, before police state enforcement was or is ever introduced. The best way to explain the aim here is simply to quote the directive, under which some of the very largest American foundations have been secretly but visibly working for years. This directive is, quote, so to change the economic and political structure of the United States that it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia, unquote. Now, these foundations, influential as they are, nevertheless are comparatively just a very small part of the tremendous forces at work in America today to accomplish this aim. So to change the political and economic structure of America that it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia in a one-world Soviet government. And these total forces working for this purpose, marvelously organized and brilliantly directed, use 100 to 1,000 completely misguided Americans who are not communists for every actual communist who is pulling strings behind the scenes to help them to put over their innocent and even progressive sounding plans. For the West, ladies and gentlemen, has been suffering and is suffering under many delusions. And one has been and is that our enemy is an ideology. It's exactly what the communists want you to believe, and there's a lot of effort put forth to make it all seem an ideological argument. They will go to great lengths even to support any opponent who will fight with them purely on an ideological level or plane, because that's what they want everybody to think, and it's an ideological argument. It is not. Communism is not a political party, nor a military organization, nor an ideological crusade, nor a rebirth of Russian imperialist ambition, though it comprises and uses all of these parts and pretenses. Communism, in its unmistakable present reality, and the reality for at least 75 or 80 years, if we can put it right down on paper, is wholly a conspiracy. a gigantic conspiracy to enslave mankind, an increasingly successful conspiracy to enslave all of mankind, one controlled by determined, cunning, and utterly ruthless gangsters willing to use any means to achieve their end. Now, one means, of course, has been and is to make socialism seem or sound appealing. And above all, far more important in their psychology is to make socialism seem inevitable. There's a certain appeal if you can make people think romantically socialism is wonderful. The communists use it. Far more important to them is if you can make people think it's coming anyway, it's inevitable, then why fight it? Why oppose it? It's typical of the communist methods and strategy and thought. Stalin was once asked whether he'd rather be obeyed through loyalty or fear. He said, oh, fear, of course. Loyalty is a vague thing. It's indeterminate. You can't tell. With sufficient fear, you can be absolutely certain that you'll be obeyed and what you want will be done. This is part of the communist mentality. The same thing applies here. The appeal of socialism, if it's worth anything, is fine. But if they can make everybody think it's inevitable, you can't stop it, it's coming anyway, then why fight it? That's far more important to them. Now, this operation of giving an appearance of spontaneity to a movement to the left which is conspiratorially plotted and promoted is so large that we could not possibly even outline it here. But let's look at least at one of the more spectacular means that communists designed for this promotion, namely Sputnik. And let you project the whole wheel from that one spoke. I used Sputnik in 1958 because, of course, it had just gone up the fall before. But it is just as appropriate now because it was a very major part of long-range communist plans. We're still feeling the effects of them. Now, I can't tell you how large a part of their military budget the Russians put into a crash program to get a Sputnik into the sky after goodness knows how many failures by October 1957. I cannot tell you how communist influences succeeded in arranging for reports of the Gaither Committee and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund Study Group to come out with such beautiful timing and terrifying hints to reinforce the impact of Sputnik on the American consciousness. But I can tell you exactly what the Kremlin expected to accomplish by all of this concerted ballyhoo. For years, ladies and gentlemen, we have been taken steadily down the road to communism by steps supposedly designed and always presented to the American people as ways of fighting communism. Foreign aid is the easiest and greatest example. The seed of the American foreign aid program was planted by communists. The initial small plant was nurtured by communists. And the whole growth of the poisonous vine to its present monstrous spreading size has been due to communist plans and efforts. I'd like to have a whole day to talk about foreign aid, primarily to show the ways in which it has helped, that has been designed to help the communists. There are about 9 or 10 major ways. One, of course, has been through the direct giving of our American money, millions and hundreds of millions of it, to communists like Gomulka, and in Tito's case, over $2 billion, and Sukarno's and others. Another way has been using our foreign aid money to put in the hands of leftists or pro-communists in different countries to build up their prestige. The same thing we were talking about this morning in the Alliance for Progress, which is one example in form of foreign aid. There have been all kinds of other uses of it, but the most important value of foreign aid to the communists, even more important than all of this money that's gone into their hands, is one the American people have never even dreamed of or thought about. Extremely important. It goes back to our anti-colonialism business. The communists have used this anti-colonialism drive as a means of taking over so much of Asia and Africa and the rest of the world, and of making the powers of Europe hated, stirring up racial bitterness, religious bitterness, everything else, bitterness between the natives of the different countries and the Europeans. They have used the whole anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism theme to tremendous advantage as one of their great modus operandi methods of doing business for a long time. And they had to, in the nature of things, make this imperialism tar stick to America. They had to get America represented in the hatred they were stirring up against the imperialist nations. Now, the United States has never been imperialist by the sword. It's been so completely the opposite. And this was so well known from its record that nobody, not even the communists, could convince any sizable number of people, of the natives in Asia and Africa, within the time that they had to work, that the United States was imperialist in that sense. So they set out instead to make the United States imperialist by the dollar. And they have done an incredibly good job of it. Now, human nature being what it is, conquest of one nation by another by the sword creates bitterness at the time, is forgotten with remarkable quickness. We conquered Japan, a very proud nation, and sent MacArthur in to sit over and above their emperor, whom they practically regarded as a deity. Not only did we do that, but in the conquering of Japan, we were led by communist influences to do horrible things, such as refusing their surrender for months. The Japanese had been trying desperately to surrender for months, and it first began by being stupid enough to send the notes through Stalin's agents. When they woke up, that wasn't working. They kept trying, but of course in our government, Stalin wanted the war kept going just as long as he possibly could, for all kinds of reasons. And in our government, there were enough people that knew that and understood that they managed to stave off or refuse to get or see or find out. So the Japanese were trying to surrender for months. And during this time that they were already completely licked and knew it and trying to surrender, for no reason whatsoever, except Stalin wanted in the total future picture, we dropped bombs on two of their cities, killing maybe 150,000 civilians. I've forgotten the populations, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 150,000, Larry, or something like that?
It was more than that.
More than that killed? Well, he says more than that. And anyway, this was just absolutely of no value in the military thing at all. The Japanese were trying to surrender. We did it. So what I'm trying to say is that we conquered Japan under the conditions that the worst you could possibly imagine for creating resentment, bitterness, and yet inside of a very few years, partly because of MacArthur's ability, dignity, sense, the Japanese came to like America very much. They worked out a peculiar quirk for themselves, that they, the Japanese, were wonderfully smart, great, able people. Anybody could conquer them must be really good. The Americans had conquered the Japanese, therefore Americans must be wonderful to have conquered them. And it was sort of a self-pride kind of a thing. But they also learned fast, and by 1955, I mentioned I was in Tokyo, Americans were being very well treated in Japan. The communists were already, MacArthur was gone, the communists were already beginning to build up fast. But they hadn't got far enough yet with what Americans were being very well treated. And the Japanese the Japanese people lost their resentment. That's how quick imperialism by the sword can disappear. But imperialism by the dollar, as the communists well knew, the hatreds it stirs up are something different. You take, you can have hundreds of illustrations. Take one detachment of our foreign aid group in Iran. There were 53 or 55. I should get these figures exact. There's right around 53 people in it. This included the head of the detachment, the assistants, the secretaries, the clerks, the office boys, and everything else. Remember, this is in a country where only the royalty and the very, very richest could have automobiles. And if this was 53, there were all but 3 or 4 of them, it was 49 or something like that, had automobiles. These are people, most of them never made over, this is back after all, 15 years ago, 1950, around there. These people, most of them never made $50 a week in their lives, a lot of them. They all had automobiles, and all but about 8 or 10 of them had native chauffeurs. And they all looked down their noses at the natives and made it clear that you better do what we want or we won't give you our nickels. They set up their own circles, and they refused to condescend, to have anything to do with the natives except the very top and so forth, and set up their places with the native servants and all of that, and lorded it over the natives in every way possible, and by the worst kind of snobbery on the part of people that never amounted to anything before anyway. The best of them were just a bunch of bureaucrats of the worst order. But on top of all of that, as if that wasn't enough, it was Lenin himself who said, to make a country really hated, you must not only make it look hateful, but also make it look ridiculous. And our whole foreign aid program, ladies and gentlemen, was designed to make us hated as imperialists by the dollar, but also made to look ridiculous. And billions of dollars have been spent specifically to make us look ridiculous. And this particular detachment in Iran was building roads that went no place, bridges where there were no streams, and apartment houses that nobody could live in. And utterly laughable, ridiculous, and hated. That's what we were making us. Now, I studied that particular detachment enough. I knew the details better some time back, and haven't looked them up for quite a while. But I was given a 2-day seminar in Thousand Oaks, California, and I gave this illustration of this particular detachment in Iran, and I explained exactly as I'm doing here that these facts are all complete and right, except I wasn't absolutely certain to the last 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 automobiles and so forth, but the whole thing was true. And a man came to me during the next coffee break, said, Mr. Welch, I know quite a bit about that Iran thing. Would you like to have me get up and say something about it? I said, sure, I would. So after the coffee break, I explained, ladies and gentlemen, there's a man here that knows something about this particular detachment of our foreign aid group that I was telling you about, and he says he'd like to make a few comments, so let's let him. And he got up and he said, ladies and gentlemen, my father was the president of the construction company that built that road to go to no place, that went nowhere, and of the bridges across where there were no streams. And he was so disgusted, made him so mad, he resigned and quit and got out of the whole picture. And he went on to tell some more. He said, my father was the man that did it. And this was a man sitting in my audience. We've had a lot of these kind of things happen in connection with some of the foreign aid picture. Is that this particular detachment is purely an illustration of thousands of them, was making America incredibly hated and ridiculed by the Iranian people. And it went on everywhere. And they convinced the whole world that America was an imperialist nation. You see, we weren't going in there and telling the people what they had to do, going in as conquerors with a sword and say, we've conquered you and you must do this. We were going in and saying, you either do it or we won't give you our nickels, and using every kind of social pressure and everything else, with the result that we were hated as imperialists, as trying to run their country, their area, their government, their people, and everything. And the communists have used our foreign aid program more effectively as a means of making America completely hated as imperialist than for any other purpose. It's done them more good for that purpose. I've seen it happen. I've been fortunate enough to be able to take money I saved and made myself. I've never traveled on anything else. I always refused to go near our State Department. I never went even near one of our embassies or consulates but once in my life, and that was in Iraq. Made me so damn mad, if you'll pardon my saying so, I swore I'd never go back. Incredible. But anyway, I have been fortunate enough to be in a great many of these countries and parts of the world we're talking about, and I have seen it. I've seen the results both ways, before and after. I've seen results of how incredibly America was loved in Turkey in 1949. And I've seen illustrations of how much we are hated in so many of the countries of the world today, in fact, by the people in practically all of them. And it's our foreign aid money more than anything else, and the uses made of it has done that, and it has been used for that purpose, ladies and gentlemen. It's what was planned for it. Now, our foreign aid has done some good for our side, the anti-communist side here and there, and in some places, of course. I myself have seen places where it's done a lot of good, comparatively. In Formosa, I'm going to take a minute or two to tell you about it. I have sat on the dirt floor of a peasant in Formosa the day his 6 months rice bill came in. I was having tea with him, sitting on the floor. The peasants in Formosa, their huts are mostly brick. Made out of brick, all 4 sides, with a door in the brick, open door, No actual door, but a doorway. And it's quite solidly constructed, but no floor. No, nothing. The floor is just the dirt that was there. And I was sitting on the dirt floor with this peasant and with an interpreter, as I say, having tea when his 6 months rice bill came in. He was quite happy. Now, here's what I mean by the 6 months rice bill. Here's the story. When Chiang Kai-shek took over Taiwan, we called Formosa, he had many, many problems. And one was that the land all belonged to the native Taiwanese, naturally. And Chiang brings with him to Formosa, there's about 8 million of them. Chiang brings with him to Taiwan, they follow him, around 2 million from the mainland of China, many of whom had come from very prominent families, had had great wealth and many servants for generations, are now absolutely penniless. They land in Taiwan penniless when around them are some of the rich Taiwanese, rich by their standards, not by ours. And yet these people from the mainland are the ones running the government and sort of necessarily lording it over the natives who are there in Taiwan. It was quite a problem. But for very brilliant handling by Chiang Kai-shek, it could have been made into, and if the communists had had a chance, they would have made it into a terrific problem for him. And that's a case, I think, where you can give Chiang Ching-kuo a lot of credit. Chiang Ching-kuo is Chiang's son by his first wife, the one he divorced in order to adopt aside in order to marry T.V. Soong's daughter, Madam Chiang, his present wife. And so there's been always possible problem there in the natural somewhat feeling between Madam Chiang and Chiang Ching-kuo, but they've handled it pretty well, I think largely through Chiang Kai-shek's handling and maybe the son. But anyway, Chiang Ching-kuo, the son, has been in charge of what we'd call a combination of our armed forces and the FBI in this country for a long time. And he's never put up with any monkey business. He's been smeared as actually being a communist because he spent about a year or two in Moscow. And actually, apparently, he learned a heck of a lot in Moscow, and he knows how to handle it. He's done a good job. They never got anywhere, but here was an opening for terrific trouble. And Chiang set out to take care of that and a lot of others. And the particular development I'm talking about, I never get at it, was this. You see, on the mainland of China, Mao Zedong built up this agrarian reform. You've got to take the land from the landlords who own 10 or 15 acres. That was quite a landlord. It takes about 2.5 acres in China to support a family, the way they manicured every blade of the rice and so forth. You're going to take the land from the landlords and give it to the peasants. And of course, this was just a way of stirring up bitterness and hostility and trouble as they swept over different areas and took over in China. They took the land from the landlords and chopped their hands off at just above the wrist here and their feet at the ankle and threw them beside the road. And as long as they had relatives who could possibly take care of them, they lived, and then they died of starvation, disease, gangrene, or what. Mao made this quite a program for the landlords in the mainland of China. And of course, they took the land and made it part of the state collective property to be operated by the communes. So Chiang Kai-shek pointed out to the landlords of Taiwan that he, Chiang, thought he was going to be able to save Formosa from the communists, maintain it as a free country, but who knows? Maybe he couldn't. And that if he didn't succeed and the communists came and took over, it was not going to be a very happy arrangement to be a landlord. This is one way to get them ready and willing to sell their land. And he had some very good ideas for why he wanted this. So he got that idea spread. Then he set up committees to determine the price of the land. Landlord that had 15 acres was quite wealthy. A man with 10 acres, enough to take care of 4 families, was still a pretty rich man. The idea was to sell 2.5 acres to any peasant worker on the land who wanted to buy it. Well, of course, they'd have to buy it on long terms. And Chiang knew that he had no backing for his money sufficient to mean anything. Chiang Kai-shek's a very honorable man. Not quite, in my opinion, the incredibly great Christian gentleman that Syngman Rhee was. I might say in passing, Syngman Rhee was to me the greatest living human being. But Chiang Kai-shek is a great Christian statesman. A great gentleman. And he knew that he couldn't be sure of the value of his money. So he arranged with the landlords to sell their land on 20 notes at 6 months apart, 10 years terms, at a certain amount, long before it was ever paid for, the money might be worth 1/5 what it was worth then, and the landlords would never get their equity for their land. And that wasn't fair. He wanted no part of that. So he determined that the price was to be set up by these committees of the local peasants and the landlords for what this land was worth in certain money value of the money then. That money was to be then converted into a certain amount of rice, and the notes were to be for a certain amount of rice. So no matter what value the money became in rice, the landlords would get over 10 years the value that it was worth when they sold the land in rice, a staple commodity. It was arranged that this land was to be bought, say 2.5 acres, by a peasant, and the peasant was to pay it all back in rice, or in the money value of rice at each 6 months period when it came, to the government. The government had to be the agency in between here. The government would pay the landlords 70% of the price in money, or in rice, right then, but the other 30% in industrial stock. What Chang wanted was to develop bicycle factories and cement block factories and the kind of small operating industry, the small manufacturing that Formosa needed so bad, and which he has developed there very well, and business along the American lines. And he wanted to set up little corporations and have them run by good, frugal, able people, may not know much, but would learn. But he figured that the Chinese landlords, the ones who'd been frugal enough to own these 10 or 15 acres and hang on to them, were the kind of men would be the very best to run these little industries. So it was arranged that they would be paid 70% in money, or rice, or the equivalent, and 30% in stock in these little industrial corporations, which they were. And it worked out very well. It gave the native Taiwanese landlords something to go ahead to grow, in a way to grow and become more prosperous in a more modern way, and in industry and business. Gave the peasants a chance to buy their land, and it's worked out very happily. As I say, I was sitting having tea on the floor with this Chinese peasant when his rice bill came in, a 6 months payment, how much he had to pay on his land. He had the rice, or the money equivalent. He was very happy and was working out fine. This was real agrarian reform as against the phony business that Mao Zedong had talked about. One of the things Chiang had in mind was to have this become known all over the mainland of China, to what they had done, as have so many other things, because Formosa has become a showplace that drives the Chinese communist regime crazy right across the Formosa Straits there, a showplace for all of Red China that can learn anything about it. Now, the reason I brought all this in is it took some money, took some capital to handle this. It's a banking operation in a way, and it took some know-how. Chiang didn't have the money or any banking agency that had, and nobody that had the know-how. Both were furnished by our Foreign Aid Department. It was a comparatively small amount of money, and a comparatively few people, few men, good, dedicated, public-spirited human beings and citizens that understood it and knew what to do and did it. The whole thing was made possible by our foreign aid program. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's make clear that our foreign aid program has done some good in some places. I can tell you some places in Germany it's done some good. But let's make further clear that if it hadn't, the communists would have sure found some way to make it do so. The last thing in the world the communists ever want is an all-black instrumentality. They can't keep them working. They get exposed. They want every instrumentality of theirs as something in which, with regard to which they can point out very clearly, definitely, and accurately and truly the good it's done. And it's done some good. So they can hold that up and confuse people and make them believe it's worthwhile. Our foreign aid money, 5 to 10% of it, our foreign aid operation, the whole thing has done good. And this is what's enabled them to blind the American people enough to keep expanding it to where it's $100 billion or something we've now spent, made America hated all over the world, helped the communists all over the world, and done all kinds of things that are help to the total purposes of the communist conspiracy. On the balance sheet as a whole, let me repeat, the American foreign aid program from its inception until today has been of tremendous help to the communists, as it was designed to be in the first place, and it has been carefully groomed to be ever since. But please note that the foreign aid program was sold to the American people, and even after it became an incredible monstrosity in both size and visible results, has been kept sold to the American people as a means of fighting communism. The communists have not taken over this much of the world by lies and deception and cunning, without the cunning being brilliant in conception and professional in execution. They well knew that the American people would accept more sacrifices for the sake of fighting communism than for any other purpose. So the one sure way to get us to do exactly what the communists wanted, as in the foreign aid program, was to put it over as a supposed means of doing that very thing, fighting communism. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had exactly the same principle and guile at work in another area. Although the danger to ourselves has been and remains almost entirely internal, from communist influences right in our midst and treason right in our government, the American people have been persuaded that our danger was from the outside, was from Russian military superiority. And under the excuse of preparing to match that military might, or of defending ourselves from this threat of outside force, in other words, under the guise of fighting communism, we have been stampeded and are still being stampeded into the biggest jump ever towards, and perhaps the final jump right into, socialism and then the communist camp. I'm going to touch on that disarmament business and the incredible hoax and fraud that it is, and how it's the worst of all the pieces of communist propaganda and deception we face, because it fools more good people. I'll give you an illustration. A man named Mallon, about 6 years ago, wrote a booklet, paper-bound, red cover, sold for 75 cents. He had just been in Russia several months, and he had succeeded somehow in visiting all of their plants, their armaments, their preparations for military war, and boys, their progress was incredible. It was terrific. It was They were just about ready to start shooting stuff from Moscow right on top of Washington. And if we didn't get busy and forget everything else and build up our technological military advances so we could match that, we were gone. And this was about the time the society was getting started. It had just got started, it was about 1 year old, and we said in big type and loud language, horseradish. Utter nonsense, nothing to it. In the first place, the guy couldn't have been there unless the communists wanted him to be. He couldn't possibly have published this unless they wanted it published. The whole facts were so obviously otherwise. Sheer nonsense. We lost just because we said this guy Mallon was communist propaganda, no matter how it was disguised. We lost Robert Heinlein and his wife from the society. I don't know how many of you that name means anything to, but he's probably the greatest, most prosperous writer of science fiction in the world today. Tremendous, very good people. But he got so wrapped up in the Russian technology and believed this. My very good friend Bonner Fellows pulled away for a long time, wouldn't have Bacchus or anything, because, Bob, I hate to disagree, but you're crazy. Our danger is they're liable to get in the head so fast to come over here. I said, Bonner, nonsense. They got nothing except what they steal from us. That's a matter of controlling the internal subversion in our country to keep them from doing it. Not any worry about their use of military might. All right, that was 6 years ago. About 6 months ago, a man named Mallon, he uses a different initial this time, but I'm not sure it isn't the same one. I don't know. This one says he was a reporter for Time. He writes a book called Fortress Cuba, published by of all people by Regnery, a very good friend of mine, a good anti-communist. And this Mallon's point is that he knows what he's talking about because he spent weeks and weeks with Castro in the Oriente Hills. So he knows. The first place you ask yourself, how the heck was he allowed to be up there if he wasn't a friend of Castro? The second place, he knows all about the Bay of Pigs and what happened because he's the one American correspondent that stayed through it all and was in Cuba after it was over and allowed to stay and got all the facts about it from the Cuban side inside after it was over. You can be darn sure no American correspondent was allowed to be there under those conditions after that unless Castro wanted him. People don't stop to think about that. But his whole point is that Cuba has become a fortress, such a great base and bastion for communist military might that our whole danger and worry is they're liable to flood right across and take us over by the military advance. Because it's sheer nonsense of the worst order. The whole thing is intended to distract the minds of the American people from the one danger, which is internal subversion. It's all a part of that. What difference does it make, ladies and gentlemen, when you got two puppets on the end of strings and one force, one hand, one person up here controlling, maybe two hands, but controlling the two strings? What difference does it make in which scale or which hand down here the arms are in or the guns are in? The thing to go after is the controlling force that's controlling both of them. But what the communists want us to do is spend all of this time fighting and arguing and worrying over how much of this armament which we are producing is in this hand. It doesn't make a bit of difference, except for the psychological value thereafter. This whole disarmament thing, we're all opposed to disarmament. Don't get me wrong. We say it in the Blue Book and said over and over. Keep your powder dry and keep plenty of it. But as a matter of basic natural common sense and long-range strategy, not because there's any danger from the Russian military might. If there is any danger, it's solely because of their control, or the control of their bosses above them, of Washington. But let it happen, because they're all in the same hands. That's the thing they don't want us to discover. The things they don't want American people to study is the internal subversion, the amount of treason that's determining what we do. And all of this argument about Russian military might is a part of the battle. There again, we've been spending $40 or $50 billion a year, wasting it, of course, as we all know. We can give you some incredible cases of deliberate waste out of the part. But all as a way of distracting the minds of the Americans from the real danger, which is internal subversion. Then one of the purposes, great purposes of NATO, of course, is to do that. Most Americans never even realized they forgot the background of NATO. They accepted NATO as an honest effort to fight communism. Of course, NATO was another one of those things to do exactly what the communists wanted under the guise of fighting communism. NATO was conceived by Dean Acheson and fathered by Harry Truman, and then tutored and brought up by Dwight Eisenhower. They're the three men that made NATO. And if you can find an anti-communist Realman among the three of them, maybe Truman's got little of it, but that's the story. And NATO is just part of this whole hoax of the same kind. This all, don't forget, is despite the fact that most of the people in NATO, most of the generals, most of the admirals, perfectly honorable, honest patriots of their respective countries. They're going along and swallowing the propaganda. Whatever they do seems to fit. It's made to seem to fit, without realizing that at the top the whole thing is being manipulated for the purposes that the communists want. Now, the communists have used this threat of Russian military might for years, as I said. They've practically accomplished it now. But what they set out to do, and with Sputnik as one of the great psychological pushes to have it happen, was to stampede the United States into a huge, new, bigger jump towards regimentation, government controls, government spending, higher taxes, all of these things. We list them presently. The biggest jump ever, and perhaps a sufficient one to be a final jump right into socialism and then the communist camp. So after that much digression, I'm going to go into what the specific aims of the communists were for the United States to be brought about by Sputnik.